All right, this is our jam-packed panel, and we gave them the best hour of the day, what I call nap time. But this is
between us and the wine is.
yeah, that's right, and between you and the wine. But this is a very interesting panel. I think, at least for those who are new to the issue, we have some preconceived ideas about what energy companies are, what First Nations issues are, what community issues are, interests are, what partnerships are. And I think the practical aspect, sort of how the rubber meets the road, can be quite different. The Enbridge has a report. Do we have copies of your report out there?
I just bring it up with me. I don't know.
Trevor, wherever Trevor is, we need copies of that report. But in one of the opening pages of the report, there's a note from Roxana, and it basically says, as a company, I'm going to paraphrase you, and I'm going to paraphrase you wrongly, so you can throw something at me. But it says, as a company, we're not just doing this because it's the right thing to do. We're doing this because this is good business, and ultimately that is what's going to make this sustainable. So I think that is a really interesting starting point and something that we want to explore here. So this is our panel 3. This is our, what are we calling it officially? Partnerships between Indigenous communities and energy companies. Wow, that was inspired. Speaking, we have Roxana Benoit, who is there, Vice President, Public Affairs, Communications and Sustainability, Enbridge. As Vice President, Public Affairs, Communications and Sustainability, Roxana is accountable for managing Enbridge's relationships with local, provincial, state, and federal governments, interactions with members of the communities in which we operate and in which we are proposing and constructing new projects and fostering and growing relationships within Aboriginal communities. And as you know, of course, Enbridge is a truly transnational cross-border company, so lots of issues, a multiplicity of things that they are facing. So next to Roxana is Sheldon Watney. Sheldon is President and CEO of the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resource Centre of Excellence. He is a member of the Red Pheasant Cree First Nation in West Central Saskatchewan, where he previously served as chief. Sitting beside Sheldon is Arlene Strom. Arlene is Vice President, Sustainability and Communications for Suncor Energy. In that capacity, she is responsible for stakeholder and Aboriginal relations, communications and sustainability, including management of the Suncor Energy Foundation. And sitting beside Arlene is Melody Lapine. Lapine or Lapine?
Lapine.
Lapine. She is a director for the Mikisew Cree First Nation. She's a specialist in environmental conservation and sciences. And I think it is interesting, you're also a student at the University of Alberta, right?
I was a U of A
You
student.
were at the University.
Years ago.
And the combination of traditional knowledge and Western science is particularly interesting. She works on oil sands regulatory interventions, co-developing the Mikisew consultation protocol, numerous traditional land use studies, and oil sands application reviews, including initiating community-based environmental monitoring program, and participating in multiple government policy initiatives. And because this is such an interesting subject, and because it's got such international implications, we were invited some bench strength to the room as well. And this is my friend Ruslan Garipov. Ruslan is an international scholar. He is at our Polar Initiative, and he is a specialist in Indigenous energy natural resource projects worldwide. You are both a Russian expert, but you are also with the Homer law firm of Washington, D.C. And you've published widely in all sorts of journals, etc. So I'm going to ask the simple-minded questions, and Ruslan's going to ask the tougher questions. So you'll get sublime and the ridiculous. But to start, we're going to follow the same process that we did with the other panels. Now, we're taking sort of a case approach to this, or or a company approach, in that we have speakers from the company and from the First Nations perspective for each organization. So we're going to have Enbridge speak, and then Suncor as well. They're going to talk about specific projects, but also maybe expand on that in some of their other projects and activities as well. So I am going to invite my friend Roxana Benoit to speak first and give us some stage setting remarks and experiences from the Enbridge perspective.
Great. Thank you, Laura. I have to say, as a pipeliner, I feel a little naked without a map. So bear with me as I try to describe things. Enbridge is the largest energy infrastructure company in North America. We operate in 8 provinces, 41 states, and we move about 20% of the gas consumed in the United States. We move about 65 to 70% of the Canadian oil that gets imported into the United States. We have a 3.5 million customer gas distribution company in Ontario, and we have a significant renewables portfolio, which I believe we are the only company in the midstream sector to have a portfolio like that. Several $1 billion worth of wind energy, a lot of it offshore in Europe. So we cover the gamut and sort of can see how things are moving with respect to transition, with respect to sustainability. And for us, what we do with our relationships with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people is we really consider it a critical core competency for our company. That it is something that we need to be leading edge at, we need to be really good at, and we need to be able to bring our Indigenous community partners into our plans and into our activities. What's really important for us, we're always looking at safety and environmental risk mitigation, but for us it's also as important is how we do that. And that's really what we consider to be a competitive advantage, as Laura mentioned. This is about business as much as it is about doing the right thing, and we're lucky that these two things sort of converge if we do it right. So we really consider our ability to have positive relationships with Indigenous communities a competitive advantage. And in that context, we go beyond compliance, or at least that's our aim. The previous panel spoke a little bit about what some of the rules are and what some of the laws and regulations are. And obviously, we follow all of those rules and regulations. But we also are guided by our principles and by our values to make sure that we're doing the right thing within those regulatory and compliance frameworks, and go beyond that as often as we can to push the envelope as much as possible. And we have, over the last, 5 or 6 years, I guess, really tried to take a different look at how we do this, and made a fundamental shift in our approach. And that is, and it's been referred to a couple of times this afternoon, but that is to take a life cycle approach to our relationships with communities. Our assets are in the ground and operating for decades. And traditionally, historically, as I think Brendan mentioned, companies like Enbridge when we were in a growth period, we'd go in, we'd talk to the community, we'd come to an agreement, we'd build what we're building, and then we probably wouldn't be around that much for a while until it was time for us to do something else. And that's just not acceptable. That's not the way that we can do business anymore. That's not the way we do business anymore. But I have to tell you that it's not easy to do this. For the Line 3 replacement project, for example, just on the Canadian side, and just for context, this project is about 1,000 miles that goes from Alberta into Superior, Wisconsin, only about 12 miles in North Dakota, 12 miles in Wisconsin, the rest of it in Minnesota. We consulted with over 350 First Nation and Métis organizations and communities. That's a lot of effort and a lot of resource, but it was important that we do it. I think there was some discussion about how deep that consultation needs to be depending on proximity to your project, et cetera. But nonetheless, on the Canadian side only, over 350 organizations were involved in discussions with us. And so as we went through this process, and questions came to us from various partners, from financial institutions and others, and including from Indigenous communities about how are you doing this, what's the outcome that you're looking for. We decided to write a discussion paper about what our approach is. We use line 3 as an example, and we wanted that to really be the foundation for some in-depth discussions with Indigenous communities to get their input, to work with us on building how we can make this better. And that's really the sort of co-creation. Not sure co-creation is where this is going. That's what we're waiting to get some input from, and we'll have further discussions. But it gives you a sense of how seriously we are all taking these sorts of activities. So 1,000 miles, over 300 groups in Canada. We had significant early consultation, excuse me, and that consultation was meaningful in the sense that we made changes to our project. We moved things, we added things, we went underwater as opposed to on the bottom of water, things like that, where we heard from particularly First Nation and Métis communities that there were sensitivities there. I also want to add that this is not always just about land disturbance or impact to water. There's also special places, spiritual places, historical places that need to be recognized, and we need to work with First Nation and Métis communities to ensure that those places are not disturbed either. So a lot of work goes into all of this, a lot of discussion, a lot of consultation. We currently on this project, because we are constructing in Canada right now, have over 1,000 Indigenous First Nation and Métis people working on the right-of-way. That's about 20% of our workforce. We committed to, I think, $275 million worth of procurement on the Canadian side, and we expect to exceed that by at least 50%. So that's a significant amount of economic benefit. Joint approach to monitoring. Corey and Joe talked about monitoring. We have construction monitors, cultural monitors, environmental monitors, so a number of Indigenous people working with us to ensure that we are sensitive to things we might not be aware of. We have agreements with about 78 communities or organizations. Those agreements also include community investment, they include capacity funding, they include training. We ran several hundred people through Pipeline 101 training, working with unions. We're also on the U.S. side. We haven't started construction, but in Minnesota we've made a $100 million procurement commitment for the tribes in Minnesota. The rules are different, as I said, but we feel that it's important that as a company we are consistent in our approach with tribes as we are with First Nations. So we've just recently come to an agreement with the Fond du Lac tribe, and our right-of-way goes through their reserve. So we're really pleased about that and working closely with them. Again, cultural surveys are happening in Minnesota. And the last couple of points I want to make are that we have, in order to reach those targets on procurement, we've established a specific unit in our supply chain group. They are located, one on the Canadian side in Calgary and one in Duluth, Minnesota. Their specific role is to search and find Indigenous-owned businesses to ensure that we have a strong database of who's out there, what they do, how we can get them engaged in our project. We put companies together with Indigenous community companies so that we create joint ventures that we can, that the Indigenous-owned company can then get some experience and generate some revenue. We have been working really closely with our bankers, our lenders, and our investors. As Olga knows, we talk regularly to ensure that there's a clear understanding of what the reality is on the ground and what our approach is and how we are managing some of these issues. We have incorporated Indigenous issues into our investment review process internally, so that before we invest in a project or we invest in buying an asset, we have a due diligence process that takes into account what are the implications on an Indigenous community. Do we have a relationship? Can we build a relationship? And the last thing I'll say is that we have also incorporated internally into our decision-making process a vice president level steering committee that provides guidance and direction to our groups, and whether it's on construction or operations or the engagement team, on what the framework is and what the objectives are, and how we're expecting those objectives to be met. So the whole discipline of this and how we're doing it is changing significantly. We know it's going to continue to change, hence the discussion paper, getting some input so that the communities we're actually working with can provide us with their advice and views on how to make what we're doing even better. I think I'll end there.
Great, thank you. Well, Sheldon, I'm going to ask you to speak next, but I just wanted to focus. You know, you've turned around. You led the Alberta Clipper blockade, I understand, and now you're in a very public partnership with Enbridge. So, what happened?
I don't know if it's so much if I turned around, but
They turned around, not
yeah,
you.
I think we've worked into I guess a bit more of a collaborative relationship. And as was mentioned, I'm from Red Pheasant First Nation, former chief, tribal chief of BATC. So, when the Alberta Clipper project did come through, was being proposed and started construction, again, we're involved with Enbridge and the NEB through the hearings. And I just want to back up a little bit and explain some of the concepts. I know some of the folks on the previous panel had talked a bit about aspects of consultation and some understandings around that and where we are and perhaps where we're going forward. And you'll hear a lot of conveyances from leadership and elders within our communities around inherent in treaty rights. And it's an important understanding that we do not have rights as First Nation or Indigenous people because of treaty. We have rights because they were created or given prior to treaty, and that's what we refer to as inherent rights. So, from that context, when we do refer or ask advice or guidance from our elders within our community, they come from that perspective, and that perspective has the immediate and important fundamental tie to the land and resources. And it's from those teachings and those guidances that people like myself are in these positions, and it's very important that we work to balance those teachings and those importance in regards to our, I guess what we regard as more formal Western resources to more spiritual, cultural, and traditional resources. How do we move forward with economic opportunities and balance those the potential of the environmental impacts that may affect negatively our hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering, are what are coined as treaty rights, and oftentimes what we refer to as inherent rights. And it's from those principles that we move to engage with government and industry. And it gets to be very complex when we move not only into business transactions, but when aspects do come forward as duty to consult. And we move from an inherent right to a treaty right to a constitutional situation or understanding. It becomes very complex because you have a Canadian Constitution that, that reads Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. And who determines what those rights are? And then you have the Indian Act, which is a very scripted and oftentimes encapsulating piece of legislation that restricts First Nations or Indigenous people from moving forward. So we're at some of those crossroads now, and I think it's important to explain some of this from at least my perspective and some of the dialogue I've been involved in over the past number of years, because it relates directly to natural resource pipeline projects and those types of things, to have a good understanding of where we're coming from as First Nation or Indigenous people, and moving into being involved. So the more practical exercise of being involved in a partnership, a business relationship in relation to an oil sands initiative or a pipeline project. And coming from these types of teachings and principles, but also understanding that our people they want to work. They want to provide for their families in today's society. And much of our economy is guided by natural resource projects. And when you're on the reserve, and I know some of the other people have talked about it, but there's a balance between perhaps some of the negative situations our people are in, but there's a lot of positives as well. So it's not always chief and council may not have time to talk to you because they're dealing with suicide and the negative, but they may be dealing with a gaming agreement, casino stuff that's coming forward that is going to be a little bit more financially beneficial than perhaps what they're dealing with with an industry partner. So we need to start to look at our communities, our leadership in that light, that we're emerging as business partners. And I think it's incumbent also on the banks to understand that we want a direct relationship with investment, with capital, with funders as well. I've dealt a lot in oil and gas as well through the last number of years, more in relation to development on reserve. And the situation used to be where an oil company would come to a chief and council. They would, Indian Oil and Gas would come there as well. The chief and council would sign off an agreement, and then the company and Indian Oil and Gas Canada would do their thing, and the chief and council and community were then removed from the relationship. So bands started to develop band-owned companies where they actually took the lease and then dealt directly with industry. Now we're finding that happening with pipeline projects, that First Nations are developing business entities to enhance that relationship with industry. Not always just chief and council, but now we want to move into partnership. And again, I don't want to forget about the delicate balance between economic development, providing for communities, providing for families, but also ensuring that the environmental sustainability and responsibility is at the forefront. In my role, I wear many hats, deal with things from Indigenous or traditional knowledge to environmental assessment, to business relationships, to employment, all these types of things. And many of us may be aware of the Husky 16 tan spill that occurred on the North Saskatchewan River a couple of years back. So we were tasked with an independent environmental assessment on behalf of our First Nation. So we've had to ensure that we're able to build capacity, and that came along with investment from Husky as well, and working with our communities. And I think just looking at some of those issues and moving forward to where we are today, that when I was chief back in 2008, when the Alberta Clipper was coming through, and in dealing with Enbridge and industry, and we all arrive at this question where chief and council or nations will come forward and say, we want opportunity. But the question is, what capacity do you have? What can you do today? And what can we perhaps do tomorrow? What can we work on to help build each other's capacity? Because realistically, we have many of the answers that industry seeks, and industry has the capacity that we seek often as well. So it's important to build these relationships, and I know Roxanne has spoke a lot, about the improvements that Enbridge has made over the past number of years, and I've seen them all and been involved in a number of them. Changes to the Indigenous Peoples policy to better reflect some of the relationships that are occurring and perhaps will occur in the future. Building of a supply chain management unit as well to focus on tasks at hand with our people. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of room to grow, but I think that it's very important that industry and government understand that Indigenous communities they come to the table with not always the capacity that's required to fully understand and engage in a project of this magnitude. And investment needs to be put forward by industry and by government so that our people are able to come forward and make well-informed decisions. We need to talk freer, prior, and informed consent. you know, on drip principles. Very fundamental to what we do, but we need to have those resources to be able to bring that information together, that information from our elders, our community members, and our leadership, and bring that forward. So I'll stop there. I know that was a bit long-winded, but I'll add more as questions are asked. Thank you.
Can I ask either one of you? I'm going to ask Sheldon, but maybe Roxana wants to add to it. Can you give a specific example of how you build capacity in the community? I mean, say a company like Enbridge says, yeah, we're going to need 50 or 100 welders on this project. Have you got 50 or 100 welders? How do you provide the direct supports capacity building to members of your community to take advantage of the employment opportunities that might be there?
In Saskatchewan, we have a unique situation. We've over the years, and you know, thankful of course to our past leaders with the Federation of Sovereign and Indigenous Nations, formerly Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, but we do have a technical institute called Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies. So we're able to, I guess over the years, we've looked at how can we develop a first point of reference for industry and partnerships to be able to follow through. And SIIT has been one of those important institutions where they're able to, you know, Enbridge has been able to sponsor or fund programs. And there are labor force development officers in each of the communities throughout Saskatchewan that are able to move forward and organize, you know, work with their clients to bring them into training programs and get them trained. And you know, Enbridge meets on the other end of the rope with opportunity and jobs the best that they can offer as well.
Yeah, I not too much to add to that. It's about partnerships with both the community and with institutions and organizations like labor unions and we help provide resources, and we work directly with the chief and council to make sure the right people are identified to participate. The only other thing I'd add is that we put in place a kind of different program for Line 3, a labor brokering program where we worked with a few different organizations, and our contractors would go to those organizations, outline how many people they needed to do what, and those labor brokers went into the First Nation and Métis communities and got people to apply. And so it was a pretty disciplined process, but it worked really well. And as I said, 20% of the workforce is Indigenous right now.
Ruslan, do you want to ask a question specific to Enbridge, or do you want to wait till we hear from Suncor and then take them on as a...
Maybe just one
go ahead.
question. Yeah, so Roxana, you mentioned a life circle approach at the Enbridge. Can you a little bit elaborate, just explain a little bit what kind of approach is that?
Well, as I said, I mean, our assets are there and operating for decades, and we're moving away from the approach of only speaking to communities in an intense way anyway when we're in a growth period. What we're trying to do is move those relationships into regular engagement, regular conversation, participation of communities in our ongoing operations as opposed to just for construction purposes, for example. So we're still working through, and frankly want to get input from communities so that what we build is reflective of what's actually needed. But what we're thinking about is things like having ongoing monitoring programs that Indigenous communities participate with us on an ongoing basis through those decades. Having perhaps joint venturing with the First Nation to build a company that does maintenance of our facilities or of our right-of-way, so that it doesn't end and opportunity doesn't end. I mean, we don't, this is an $8 billion project, so it's a pretty big capital budget that we have to do some of this work. That's not the case when we're operating, so we've got to find more creative ways to provide opportunity and to keep the knowledge and information sharing flowing across the platform.
Sheldon, project life cycle?
Yeah, I think it's, as Roxana mentioned, that, from our perspective, we have a keen interest as well to be involved in ongoing operations and maintenance. When we're looking at integrity digs or, offering, we have a lot of partnerships that are occurring not only with Indigenous groups in Enbridge, but perhaps important partnerships that are able to take on contracts or subcontracts as part of the overall project or other projects. And I wanted to make mention of Moosomin First Nation, for instance, has partnered with Western Alliance Tubulars, and they manufacture insulated and vacuum industrial tubing for SAGD project. So these are important partnerships that are needed for our communities. Build the capacity, build the economic wealth that is able to then be reinvested back in building more capacity.
Great, great. I'm going to turn it over to the Suncor partnership story, but again, using that chair's prerogative, I'm going to ask, once we are finished, just before we end up, I'm going to put Bob Ray on notice. Would you mind giving us a couple of comments based on your experiences in Ontario on consultation issues? Could you talk to us for a little bit at the end as well? Sure. Thank you. All right. Arlene, please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Laura. And thanks for hosting this important conversation. I'm particularly happy to be sharing the stage with Melody today to talk about the East Tank Farm and our relationship. I want to start by, for those who don't know Suncor, just a small explanation of our footprint. We have capacity for producing almost 950,000 barrels of oil. So really, when you think about global demand, that's 1% of global demand. We operate from coast to coast in Canada. Primarily, though, we are in the oil sands in northern Alberta. And we have business relationships with 150 of the 634 First Nations in Canada. So we have been on a bit of a journey when you think about our sustainability journey. We've had long-term environmental goals for a number of years. We had a first generation of long-term environmental goals that were coming to the end of their targets were for 2015. And as we began to think about our next generation of goals, we started to think about an ambition around our relationship with Aboriginal peoples in Canada and a social goal, and what would that look like. So we started to talk to our Aboriginal employees, to the communities that are close to our operations, to Aboriginal leaders in Canada. And we also had, in 2014, we hosted a gathering with our community partners. There was about 100 people that we fund from our community partners, and we had 20 Aboriginal youth that were there at that gathering as well. And we were talking about building capacity and creating opportunities for Aboriginal youth. And this one courageous young Aboriginal man stood up and said, you've been talking a lot about how you can help us. I think you really need to reframe how you're thinking and talk about how we can help you. And it was one of those seminal moments in how we were thinking about our ambition and our goal. And we realized that we needed to have a goal that reflected that we needed to do things differently. So our goal became, we're going to change the way we think and act in order to increase the participation of Aboriginal peoples in resource development in Canada. And we set out targets that would help to measure whether we were making progress towards changing the way we think and act. It's not quite perfect, but we set out those targets. And so it was about that time that we also were in negotiations with 3 communities in northern Alberta. So we had, we merged with Petro-Canada in 2009. At the time, it was the largest merger in Canada. And we brought together a bunch of different projects and a bunch of disparate commitments, some of which we were living up to, some of which we weren't, some of which the communities cared about, some of which they didn't. And it didn't reflect it didn't even, when you pulled it all together, reflect a body of commitments that reflected our mutual interests. And so we knew we needed something different. So from 2012 to 2014, we were in this negotiation of agreements. And we were looking at sort of more, if I would say, conventional impact benefit agreements. And at the time, when we actually started to peel back the onion and really talk about what interests were, we realized that we needed to do something completely different. And so one of the communities, one of the nations, suggested that they wanted to be a part of owning our assets, or a portion of our assets. And that's how we got to really thinking about this East Tank Farm deal, which is an equity partnership with 2 First Nations, the Mikisew Cree First Nation and Fort McKay First Nation. It's a $500 million equity partnership. And so from that, we're able to address mutual interests. Now, it doesn't mean we don't disagree on some things, because we still do, but we're working, it allows us to focus on those things that we have in common. So I'll just share a few of the lessons that we learned through that journey, and then turn it over to Melody to talk a little bit about this from her perspective. But first of all, we learned that, going back to our social goal, I would say we learned that looking back is as important as looking forward. We need to acknowledge where we've come from, and acknowledge where we've made mistakes and where we need to do things differently. And then we need to acknowledge what that future looks like, where we're truly walking side by side. So that requires relationships. It requires deep commitments. We heard from some of our other speakers the challenges of, change in governance. We had commitment from senior leaders at Suncor, from senior leaders within the communities, that bridged elections within the community, that bridges changes within Suncor. So there's deep commitment from the leadership in both Suncor and the community level. It took time. That took from these conversations in 2014 until now. It also took a particular type of asset. Suncor took the risk and built the East Tank Farm, and it was an asset that had the support of our partners. It was joint venture partners that were shipping oil to this East Tank Farm, so it had the support of our partners. And, we were able to de-risk by building the project before it closed. We also got bankers involved very early in the process, and there was deep business acumen within the communities and capacity within the communities. So it was a strong vision of multi-year support, both within the communities and at Suncor. And I would say also that, one of the things we continue to be reminded of, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. We'll explore other equity partnerships, but we also want to be guided by the interests of the community and our own interests, and that requires iteration and back and forth and deep discussions about where we have common interests and what will work for communities and what will work for Suncor. So with that, I will pause, Laura, and hand it over to Melody.
Thank you, please. And Melody, also, if you could start, tell us a little bit about the Mikisew Cree as well, if you could introduce us to your community.
Sure. So the Mikisew, so we're over half of the Indigenous population in northeastern Alberta, the area of the Athabasca oil sands. There's about 3,000 members. Our home community is Fort Chipewyan, and we sort of mainly reference ourselves as people of the Delta, the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is one of the world's largest freshwater deltas. And so a great portion of our territory is really south of Fort Chip and includes all of the oil sands areas. So a huge part of my work for the last 15 years has been working with industry on trying to minimize the environmental issues in our community, as well as maximizing benefits, key negotiations on a number of different impact benefit agreements. So the Mikisew have been pretty, I think, not just really talking the talk, but really are about action as well. We've been to the Supreme Court now twice, fighting for the protection of our treaty rights. And so I think, that's always the core principle and focus of the work that we do in our consultation work with industry and pushing government to, better policy and legislation to protect our rights. That it really about, supporting development in our region is not only on the backs of industry through industry-specific agreements, but we also hold the government quite accountable and responsible for ensuring that they're not minimizing their effort in consultation. Unfortunately, in Alberta, the province, discharges a lot of their duty to proponents and developers to do that consultation. And so a lot of our new IBAs now are really in our agreements with industry are about partial consent and about, ensuring that government is fulfilling their obligations as well. And so there was a reference to the recent Tech Frontier project, and we did sign an agreement and support the project, however, based on a number of conditions. And so now, the joint review panel is just wrapped up and hearing, various testimonies, including from us and other Indigenous communities. But we basically said, there's a number of conditions that, supported by Tech and a number of recommendations supported by Tech, but now government, you have an obligation to fulfill those recommendations. For example, ensuring the delta is protected for us. We're seeing declining water levels, ensuring they're fixing broken policies like the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan and protecting bison. So there's a number of things that fall outside of what proponents and companies can do. And so that's where we say, this partial consent will support the projects, but government, you're not off the hook. So the recent, I just want to touch on the East Tank Farm agreement, because I think it's an important one about focusing on a relationship. And so Suncor's been in our region for 40 years, and so this agreement is quite recent, and so it's really never too late to reach an agreement. It should never really be done in courtrooms or on your way to a hearing. But in this case, it happened long after their projects were approved. And so, as Arlene mentioned, sometimes corporate cultures change. They recognize the importance of working with their neighbors. In this case, Suncor recognized the importance of working with Mikisew, and we pushed hard for Suncor to reach a good agreement with us. And so, another part of the East Tank Farm agreement is really about providing certainty that we have a dispute resolution process now. So if we have these disagreements, there's an effective process to deal with these issues, and minimizing environmental concerns and joint environmental stewardship. A robust consultation process, so we don't have to rely on a broken regulatory system where we file objections and go through that whole process, which is not meaningful for communities. So I think it's never too late. A lot of times I know companies don't talk to, the lights on, lights off. After approvals are given, companies don't talk to communities. But in this case, things can be different, and they should be. After projects are approved, and if you don't have an agreement with the community, you should be asking yourself, how do I still obtain an agreement with the community, and how do I get them to support this in terms of working together through a relationship? For sometimes, in this case, it's making up for the last 40 years, but we still got a long way to go in terms of working together over the next 50 as well. Because I have an opportunity to say something right now, I wanted to ask the question with the first panel about, this new proposed bill, Bill C-69, and adding greater certainty, because there's some important aspects in that bill that could help in our region. For example, they're looking at assessing the impacts on culture and rights through this new federal legislation in Canada, undertaking regional assessments. And just yesterday, our Minister of Environment, Minister Phillips, was in meeting with senators lobbying against this bill. And so here's another example how government is trying to weaken policy and legislation to not assess important things to communities. So how can we rely on companies and industry to help lobby, government for strong legislation such as Bill C-69, and ensuring that not only industry is doing their part, but ensuring that government's doing their part as well? Because the unfortunate thing with Bill C-69 is that it may never be applied in our region. You know, we are one of the largest resource development regions in Canada, and we may have a robust and great new environmental assessment piece of legislation, but it may never be triggered. So how unfortunate would that be? So again, how do we build certainty and ensure that the government is doing their part and not just always relying on the backs of industry?
That's a great point. You seem to be describing a situation where we have enclaves of support and things that are working, but the enclaves are not necessarily linked up in a comprehensive way, or at least a way that would seem to be sustainable. So hopefully we can talk about that as we go along. Ruslan, question, comment?
Yeah. So thank you. First of all, I would like to say that I would like to emphasize the importance of our discussion today. So I'm not new at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's my third actually fellowship here, but it's first time that I participate in such a discussion where energy sector and Indigenous people, First Nations are involved. So I'm very thankful to you, Laura, to Canada Institute, that you started such a practice, and I hope we'll have a series of talks also about Russia, about Scandinavian countries and other interesting regions and their experience. So being also originally from Russia, your cases, your experience sounds very interesting, and I think very useful for other regions, and especially for Russia, because we have actually a lot in common, like vast territories, severe climate, indigenous people, different indigenous communities, reliance on energy sector. So what do you think, what is innovative, what is new, what we can learn, what other countries can learn, in particular Russia, from your experience?
Great question. Let's go. We'll start with Melody.
I think I gave the example of, you know, it's never too late. So a good example with the Suncor and Mikisew agreement is, it was achieved after 40 years of, their projects in our region. So I think that's a very valuable lesson, is that you just have to be committed. You're, willing to work hard and just never give up trying.
I see.
Arlene?
Well, I think I would add to that I think one of the things that we have learned through this journey is that it's really important to look back and say, what is it that you'd like to change about the history, and what things do we want to improve, and then how are we going to do that? So for us, it's, we look at the environment within Suncor for Indigenous employees, and what's that like? And I've heard stories from folks who, worked at Suncor 30 years ago, or folks that are within Suncor, and it's not always been good. It hasn't been an inclusive environment. So we need to own that and understand what it is we need to do differently in order to make it an environment that is respectful and inclusive. And so I think that lesson applies to policy. It applies to how we partner together on energy projects. It applies to how we resolve disputes, because it doesn't mean necessarily that because we're walking side by side or collaborating more effectively that we will always agree. So what kind of mechanisms do we use, and how do we walk forward together in a way that is respectful and acknowledges the rights of Indigenous people that are enshrined in many different places, from treaties to our Constitution to the inherent rights that we heard Sheldon talk about.
Yeah, moving right down along, Sheldon.
I'll just touch. I like my comments. I think innovative in a more recent sense. I think really, I look at it in a context of the new innovation is actually an old principle. And all that is just sitting at a table and talking and dealing with the issues flat out. Like, no hiding here and hiding there, but what are your issues? Like, First Nations, Indigenous people, what are your issues? Let's work with them. And companies actually listening, not just going to a meeting and taking notes, as we found in the big project up north, caused some issues. But we need to come together to rectify issues, mitigation, or whatever words they are, and we need to plan together. You know, we just went through, as I mentioned, an environmental assessment. We're still going on it, and I'm big on honor the crown stuff. I mean, that's very important. We rely on it. There's a fiduciary responsibility, and yes, there's a heavy reliance and an importance that industry and government meet with chief and councils, but we need to recognize also that our people individually have an expectation around sovereignty and around fiduciary responsibility. And I'm from Treaty 6 area in Saskatchewan. I'm a Cree. And my understanding is every year on Treaty Day, a Queen's representative comes out and gives Sheldon Whitney $5 of an annuity payment because of the treaty. Whether there's a chief and council or not, the Queen has a responsibility to each and every treaty Indian. So that's a big responsibility. That's a big fiduciary responsibility. And many of our people think about that in relation to projects, in relation to environment, in relation to economic development. So they want to be a part of it. They want to be part of the solution. And I mean, that's innovation is almost just looking back and just getting down to brass tacks. So thank you.
I think, Roxanne, is this uniquely Canadian, uniquely Alberta, Saskatchewanian? What's the secret sauce that would make this applicable or scalable?
The only thing I'd add to what everyone else has said is a couple of things. First of all, we hear about tone at the top, right? And if you don't have an executive and a CEO and corporate leadership, including the board of directors. I mean, we talk to our board about this all the time. They need to be very supportive and engaged and pushing you and the company to move this agenda forward. And without that, it becomes a bit challenging. And I think for both Suncor and Enbridge, we have that in spades at the top of our company, and so it makes being creative and innovative in how you approach these things a little bit easier in the sense of moving it through, but you need to have that support for sure. Then I just want to pick up on the honor of the crown and the role of the government. I think we've all kind of mentioned that, and there's only so much that an energy company can do. We can't build schools. We can't, provide doctors. I mean, those kinds of things require the government, and that's really the honor of the crown at stake a lot on those sorts of things. So, and even in the energy sector, if you look at the last couple of big pipeline projects anyway, the Trans Mountain decision and the Northern Gateway decision. The Northern Gateway decision, by the way, would have meant 1/3 ownership and governance by First Nation and Métis people. In both of those cases, the judicial review found that it was the government that was deficient in how they consulted with First Nations and Métis. It was the government that sent no takers. It was the government that didn't have decision makers engaged in the process. It was not the project proponent. It wasn't the energy company. So I think it's important to recognize that we're doing a lot of interesting things between our two companies and others in the sector, but we need to drag the government to where it needs to be. And that's really until that happens, it's going to be challenging to really fix some of the fundamentals that need addressing.
Good. You're looking at me, Sheldon, like you have something to add. You got that? Something
real quick to add, because we lived through it. And just looking at the honor of the crown, the role of the government, and in Saskatchewan, obviously, we deal with various levels of government, from RMs or urban municipalities to the provincial government to the federal government. And one of the difficult things that we face in Saskatchewan is the development of the duty to consult framework policy within Saskatchewan. So we have a framework policy that was developed solely by the provincial government of the day in 2008, the Sask Party. It was refuted by the chiefs in assembly at the FSIN, and it's continued to be utilized in terms of the consultation aspects within Saskatchewan. So we have a level of government that develops and implements a duty to consult framework policy, that's not necessarily aligned with Indigenous rights and interests or have had really any substantial input. And then it's laid on the shoulders of industry to carry out and now work with First Nations or Indigenous communities within Saskatchewan. So it starts to get very confusing. It creates a lot of issues that perhaps, you know, as we mentioned about collaboration and talking through, that could have been dealt with ahead of time. And all it really took was providing that forum and that opportunity for input, collaboration, and you know, I guess some ratification potentially at the end of the day. I mean, we have governance processes within and amongst our communities that we're able to deal with some of these hard issues nowadays. It's not a free for all. Some of our institutions are very complex and very astute at doing things. So thank you. Just wanted to add that.
I'll just
Yeah, please, Melanie.
I just want to add to what Roxana was saying just about, you know, pulling government along. I totally agree. I just want to give a reference to, you know, something that just came out of the hearing with tech was Mikisew. We did over 30 studies supported by tech, you know, financed, and again, capacity is important for communities to undertake their own research and understanding project impacts. The Aboriginal Consultation Office, who deems adequacy of consultation, did not reference not one of our studies, including our assessment on the impacts of the Frontier Project on Mikisews' rights and culture. So, you know, companies are, you know, doing the best they can, but when you have the government who won't even recognize important assessments or studies, is really quite disturbing.
That's a great point. Teck, for those who are new to this issue, Teck is a mining company in Canada. Ruslan, do you have another question? Or shall we open it up to the big?
Yeah, let's open to it.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions, absolutely. But I just wanted to make a point referring to what all of our panelists have said. One of the reasons why we're doing this, it's kind of unusual for Washington, kind of unusual for the Canada Institute, but we had here as our scholar for a number of months the late Jim Prentice, former Premier of Alberta and Canadian Cabinet Minister, Conservative. And he finished his book here, Triple Crown, and one of his major points, the point of that book is, Canada is an energy superpower. Canada cannot develop its energy resources without a great deal of ownership and equity and partnership with the First Nations community. That's a first principle. If you don't honor the Indigenous ownership and participation, you have nothing. So let's give a little tip of the hat to Jim, because he had some great ideas and we miss him. Olga, you had a question? And Mike Runner is behind you, and then the gentleman at the back with the horn-rimmed glasses.
So I think I'll ask Ruslan's question about Russia. I'll apply it to the U.S. because we're talking about North America here, and we have Canada, of course, and not the U.S. So kind of twofold question. Roxana was line 3. You guys work in the U.S. as well. So, and then to Melody and Sheldon from the Indigenous perspective. I don't know how much you guys know about the tribes in the U.S., but what would it take, in your view, as a company and as a tribal representative, for the United States, who has very similar history of suppression, to, first of all, have energy companies thinking like the Canadian companies thinking? So I don't think it's there yet. That's number one. Number two, we're not even talking about the government. So obviously the government is not right now engaging anywhere close to the Canadian government. But do you think it's going to be government wakes up, start forcing the companies, maybe proposing legislation, then companies start doing it? Or would it be what's happening actually right now, that the tribes are really disliking both the government, the companies, well, 3, and the banks for that matter? So what, I mean, I know it's not the recipe, but I'm just curious what you guys think, being really Roxana on the ground in both countries, and you as a tribal. And I don't remember Suncor. Are you guys in the U.S. as well?
We have a refinery in Colorado.
Okay, here we go. So, and then as a tribal view on the U.S. side, do you guys think, you know, any magic recipe for the U.S. to become Canada, if I could be blunt.
Worthwhile Canadian initiative.
Well, there's, you know, we work with about 30 federally recognized tribes in the United States. So, and it's we're learning every day as we go how to deal with some of the issues and how to build these relationships. The rules are different, the laws are different, some of the requirements are different. I mean, in terms of getting permitting and things like that, the role of the BIA is a little different. So there are differences, but that's what I was kind of referring to earlier when I said, yes, we follow the rules. Yes, we follow the law. But we really want to build relationships based on values and principles. So we're trying to move kind of into that space but the bottom line is that it takes time. And, you know, for a long time, this was not something that companies like Enbridge were focused on. So it's taking us time to do this, but it's about building trust and building a relationship. And that only happens by one-on-one conversations, by being present, by being in the community, by learning what the community issues are. We're spending a lot of time doing that with, I mean, currently on the Line 3 project, but so there's no substitute for that, and there's no shortcut for that. There's no other way to get there. You've just got to build that trust, and that means proving your bona fides, and so we're really focused on that. I don't know that you know, this is, I think, another circumstance where we're going to have to pull governments, and governments will have to come along as we move the yardstick, because we can't operate without having a good relationship with the tribes in Minnesota, for example. So we're really focused on that. And I mentioned we reached an agreement with Fond du Lac that we hope will be game-changing. And so we're moving forward on that and moving forward trying to reach agreement or at least establish ongoing discussions and relationships that can lead us to some sort of better agreements. But there's, you know, I mean, I guess the answer is there's no shortcut, and it's really, we've got to move the yardstick. The government, I don't see any prospect anytime soon of that changing. But I think the reality will be that they'll be forced to change because the playing field will change.
Good. And the gentleman at the back there he is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Larry Kriska, and I'm a CEO of Western Alliance Tubulars. It's a steel company in Western Canada. I just wanted to mention that it was formed on the basis, just further what Sheldon was saying earlier, we were formed on the basis with Moosomin First Nation, Treaty 6 in Canada. And it was a build it as you come, build it and they will come situation. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to make a comment, not a question, but a comment and support to Enbridge because we worked together vertically through their whole staff for the last 2 to 3 years to gather our mill to be a audited mill for Enbridge and be able to supply them in the future and make the community self-reliant and also looking at other innovative products that we're currently manufacturing, including vacuum insulated tubing for SAGD and innovation to reduce water usage in the SAGD operations in Northern Alberta. So just wanted to again thank you for a wonderful panel, and thank you Enbridge for your support.
And you're looking at other markets now too. I think you're looking at broadening your market as well, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we're looking at installing a new ERW mill as a stage 2 operation in Western Canada. So that's to complement our pipe processing mill that we currently have. Yeah.
So
Come on back next week. We'll be pounding the table on 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. But that's not today.
I want to respond really quick,
Yeah.
and I thank you, Roxana, for your comments, and Larry. I think just going back, and it might be a bit of a reiteration, but I think it's very important is to note that it's important to protect First Nation or Indigenous interests. Because, as we mentioned, there's sacred sites, there's waterways, there's traditional areas, you know, where we practice our ceremonies and our inherent and treaty rights. They're still active. and then look at promoting First Nation or Indigenous interests, because we do have economic interests, we have environmental interests, we have spiritual interests that connect all of these together, and we rely on those to carry us forward. I think those are they're fundamental, but they're so critical to success in projects. And I think with DAPL, I know with our blockade, that was some fundamental issues, was pipelines are running through our traditional and sacred areas. They're going through them without much dialogue. And that's very dear and very important and very sentimental to our people. And that it's not going to change. People they'll put themselves in front of whatever they need to put themselves in front of to stand for it. And that's not going to change. So I guess with that comment, I implore you, I encourage you to ensure that Indigenous rights are protected and Indigenous interests are promoted, because we need advocacy too. Can't be just us. And through partnerships, that being with industry and government, we need to collaborate to find some success moving forward, and that's the way we're going to do it.
Melody or Arlene or Roxanne, and then I'm going to hand the microphone to
thing,
Bob.
and that is that, for First Nations and tribal members, like that border isn't really there. So there's a lot of back and forth between the people on the Canadian side and on the U.S. side, and we encourage that and actually facilitate that and try to make sure that because it helps with some learning and some understanding of what can be and what is. So that's an important part of what we're trying to do as well. So and we found that to be quite helpful.
And there's one last quick, just 10 seconds, that because I want to substantiate that, because it goes back to a lot of the issues, because there is a lot of, via the J Treaty and these types of legal instruments, but there's a lot of trade that still occurs in terms of medicines, all these types of things that we have in our area, we bring down to the States. Likewise, we come down to the States to get different medicines and things that to take home that we use. So we practice that today. That's not 150 years ago. That occurs now. So thank you. Sorry.
No, not at all. I was just going to say two quick things. I mean, one, we talk about in Canada often, we even say we don't understand that it's not a lot of clarity around what consultation is required. There is a lot of sources to give us clarity. There is, from an international perspective, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In Canada, we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the recommendations that came from that. We have a body of Supreme Court of Canada cases that have interpreted and clarified what the constitutionally protected rights, and of course the treaties themselves. So there is a whole body of work there that informs, and I think there's lots of applicable cross-border pieces from those. And the other thing I wanted to just mention is don't underestimate the role within your own organization. At Suncor, we've certainly we believe as a significant energy company in Canada and North America, we have a role to play in reconciliation. And for us, that starts at home. We've by no means got this, figured out completely, but we believe that by starting with our own employees and helping them to deepen their level of understanding of the history and rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada, that we can then start to think broader about how we influence that within Canada.
Melody?
Just a final comment, maybe I'm not familiar with the treaties that exist here in the U.S., but for us, we're part of Treaty 8, and we've often had to rely on the courts to help us define what that means. For example, our 2005 case, where the Crown actually, before that, felt they didn't have to consult on lands taken up. However, we changed that with our new ruling. So I think it's very important for nations, any Indigenous nation, to really define, that's through self-determination, what their treaty means to them. Otherwise, it's going to be defined by others.
Good. Truett, can you give a microphone to Premier Ray? And he's the guy in the front. He's right here. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm either going to be talking to the back of people's heads or so I'm going to come down here.
You can come up on stage.
No, I don't need to do that. I'll just stand here. It's a great privilege to have been here this afternoon and to have heard from so many knowledgeable and eloquent people. I just wanted to make a couple of observations in terms of what I've heard, and which has been extremely encouraging and I think quite, in some respects, quite comprehensive. But I wanted to add two things. The first one is I have been very affected by the experience of really coming to terms in a whole variety of ways across Canada and thinking about the rest of the Americas. And that is that I think everyone has to appreciate the fact that Indigenous people have been living in the Americas since time immemorial. And the rights, as Sheldon said, do not come from the government. They don't come from treaties. They don't come from constitutions that exist in a whole variety of countries that Indigenous people were never consulted about. They come from the realization that there is an inherent right, we believe, to self-determination and to self-government that comes from the simple fact that for thousands of years, people lived in the Americas with languages, with cultures, with ways of life, with economies, and with constitutions, and with significant trading relationships that vastly preceded settlement from Europe. And we have to have that appreciation. And I think that part of what we're going through, and part of what many of the corporate spokesmen who've been speaking have demonstrated, is that these are things that everybody's had to learn, because it hasn't been the attitude with which most non-Indigenous people grew up. We didn't grow up thinking that way. We've had to learn how to think that way. And it leads to a significant change in attitude and to a significant change in terms of respect. Respect for culture, respect for language, respect for Indigenous laws, which is, we now have 2 universities in Canada which are in the University of Victoria and McGill University that are introducing law degrees in Indigenous law, not in what we have been, not what the Supreme Court thinks about things, but what are the traditions that emerge from within Indigenous communities. So we're on a voyage here. It's an exciting voyage. It's sometimes frustrating for people. They say, "Oh, it takes such a long time. It's so difficult." And then you've got to understand, and this is something that I heard so clearly today from a couple of people, we need to understand and own what's gone wrong with this relationship. And it goes back a long way, not a dozen years, but several hundred years. Terrible things that were done. And we talk about truth and reconciliation. I always refer to truth and consequences, not truth or consequences, truth and consequences. We're living with the consequences of what happens when a relationship goes really bad. And now we're trying to reestablish it in a different way. The second thing is, I think our American friends have learned a little bit of the complexity of the Canadian constitutional system. And one of the things that both Sheldon and Melody Lupine were talking about is this simple fact that the resources in Canada, according to the Constitution of 1867, are the crowns in the provinces. So we don't have one crown. We don't just have one honor of the crown belonging to one level of government. We have an honor of the crown that applies to both the federal government and the provinces. Yes, the federal government has embraced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. No province has done so. It's important to remember that. And as provincial governments come and go and change, their sense of their responsibilities come and go and change. And that's what makes this an ongoing complex set of issues. So I think what we can say is there's a kaleidoscope of experiences, from big companies to little companies, from some provinces to other provinces, from some levels of government to others. So I guess my message is, don't get discouraged by that. I know there are sometimes there are business people who say it's way too complicated to do business in Canada. No, it isn't. It's complicated to do business anywhere. And it does take a certain degree of imagination. But the reality is that if you're in the resource business, and in many other businesses in North America, but certainly in Canada, you cannot succeed unless you establish a relationship with the First Nations. Finally, one of the big problems we have to overcome is that for the longest time, governments treated the treaties as if they were a divorce settlement. We give you this, that's what it is, goodbye. And the interpretation that's fundamental, I think, to the Indigenous interpretation of a treaty is, and we've heard it today, it's a relationship. It's all about the relationship. It's not about the words in the treaty. It's about the relationship that's been established. So in a sense, it's a marriage contract. So if you thought you were getting away with sort of divorcing and moving out of here and saying, okay, now we've divided up the land, this is ours, that's yours, goodbye. We're after, particularly after the patriation of the Constitution, Section 35, we are rediscovering that this is a relationship. And I think that's a key point. And with where we are geographically and with the importance of resources in northern Canada, this is who we are now. We are a treaty nation and we are an Indigenous nation. And that has to be, it's a change in a lot of people's heads, and there's space in their heads, but it's a change that's really important. And I want to just say I think the conversation this afternoon has been terrific. It's added, I think, a lot to people's sense of the range of issues. And it also shows us, if I may say so, as somebody who's, you can tell from my hair, I've been around a bit, the conversation has changed. You know, I mean, it's not very often you would have said 15 or 20 or 25 years ago, oil and gas and resource companies and pipeline companies are going to be telling governments that they got to get with the program here and move on because we've got to establish these relationships. That's not how the conversation seemed to be emerging a while back, and that's how it has emerged today, and that's a huge shift. And we've also seen, I think, a very significant shift in the conversation from the Indigenous perspective, and I think we've heard that today as well. So that's, for me, it's been a very encouraging day. Thank you for allowing me to say a few words.
Well,
Appreciate it.
thank you, Bob. You wrapped it up and you summarized it very well. And while we are applauding, let's keep applauding for our wonderful panel. Melody, Arlene, Sheldon, Roxana, Ruslan. Standing between you and the wine, let me also just say a quick thanks to my Canada Institute team, Savannah Boylan and Mariana Sanchez, and the brilliant intern force of Narima, Evan, Truitt, Marisol, and Cassandra, who apparently her mother used to work for Bob Ray. Yay! Thank you to our sponsors and contributors. Without your contribution, we would have no programming. The embassy is go out the front door and turn right down Pennsylvania Avenue. If you've registered, then we welcome you at our reception. If you need instructions, any of the intern force or our team will help you get to where you need to be. Thank you, travelers. Thank you, panelists. It's been a wonderful event. Thank you.